Well, new tonight, a federal investigation into drug-related chemical trafficking has led the FBI to seize several homes actually right here in Horry County. Now, according to court filings, agents say that the properties were purchased with money from an international money laundering scheme tied to the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico. The case escalated after a 50,000 kilogram shipment of a meth-making chemical was seized this past May at the port of Long Beach, California, listing a Myrtle Beach address as the shipper. Now, the DEA, FBI, and the U.S. Customs continue to investigate this. No arrests have been announced. We have more details right now over on
Behind Bars, if you're lucky. The results of this historic international campaign have been absolutely phenomenal. This joint operation has resulted in the interdiction of more than 120 metric tons. Does anyone know how much that is? Of illicit narcotics. That is a massive billions and billions. And the arrest of more than 1,000 drug traffickers. These actions have denied the cartel of billions, of various cartels, of billions and billions of dollars in cash, and prevented the loss of untold American lives. And we've seen the results in the United States.
It started at 4:06 a.m. That was the first moment the floodlights snapped on above the front row of vehicles at the dealership's Flagship lot. Until then, the place looked like any other high-volume car business waiting for morning. Chrome grills reflected the last of the night. Lifted trucks sat nose to tail under giant vinyl banners promising low down payments, and everyone approved. The glass showroom was dark except for the blue glow of security monitors and the red blink of an alarm keypad near the front desk. Across the boulevard, a gas station clerk was stocking coolers. A bakery truck rolled through the intersection. No one outside had any idea that within minutes, federal agents were going to tear open one of the most sophisticated cartel laundering operations investigators had ever seen, hidden inside the U.S. used car industry. Then the convoy arrived. 3 black SUVs rolled silently through the main entrance, tires whispering over the concrete. A white federal evidence truck followed behind. Another team entered from the rear service road near the repair bays and fenced storage yard. By 4:10 a.m., the front lot was sealed. By 4:12 a.m., agents had taken positions at the showroom doors, the finance office corridor, the service entrance, and the detached records building behind the paint booth. No sirens, no warning to staff, no television cameras, only radios crackling softly in the dark, body armor shifting as teams moved into place, and the metallic snap of breaching tools being lifted into ready position. At 4:14 a.m., the signal came. At 4:15 a.m., the showroom doors were breached. At 4:17 a.m., the first team entered. The front of the business looked exactly the way successful dealerships are designed to look: clean, busy, respectable, profitable. But within minutes, that illusion began to crack. By 4:21 a.m., agents in the finance department had opened locked filing cabinets and found deal jackets with duplicate buyers. By 4:24 a.m., another team inside the title room recovered transfer packets that did not match vehicle histories already flagged in a separate narcotics finance investigation. By 4:27 a.m., forensic accountants inside the command van were comparing seized files against shell companies they had been tracking for months. And by 4:31 a.m., the case changed. Because behind a shelf in the general manager's office, agents found binders labeled by month and inventory type, with one section marked in red tabs, VIN corrections. Not title review, not registration follow-up, corrections. That single word turned the entire raid. At 4:36 a.m., the first computers were seized. At 4:39 a.m., digital forensics teams pulled dealer management records showing cars moving through multiple ownership identities far too quickly to be legitimate retail business. At 4:43 a.m., agents in the service bay office found altered VIN plates, stamping tools, adhesive overlays, counterfeit inspection labels, and paperwork for vehicles whose recorded legal identities no longer appeared to match the physical cars on the lot. At 4:47 a.m., the lead case supervisor in the mobile command unit said the phrase that would define the investigation: VIN fraud cover, not dealership sloppiness, not clerical error, cover. By 4:53 a.m., the lot manager was in handcuffs. By 4:58 a.m., a hidden wall safe behind the general manager's framed Dealer of the Year plaque had been forced open. Inside were bundles of cash, coded ledgers, handwritten inventory sheets, and a notebook containing first names, badge numbers, and phone contacts that pointed towards something even more damaging than cartel money: police protection. At 5:06 a.m., investigators pulled the first broad estimate. $500 million, that was the amount federal teams believed had been washed through the dealership chain using manipulated inventory, fake financing, title fraud, false buyers, shell companies, auction cycling, export channels, and layered vehicle transactions. $500 million. And that was only what the first records suggested. By 5:14 a.m., secondary warrants were already being executed at 2 satellite dealership locations, 1 auction yard, a finance office registered under a different company name, and a suburban home tied to the ownership structure. By 5:22 a.m., agents had begun imaging the internal sales and title database. By 5:31 a.m., the first references to law enforcement contacts were confirmed inside seized messages, and by 5:39 a.m., no one in the command van was using cautious language anymore. This was not one dirty dealership, this was a cartel-owned dealership chain, and dirty cops, investigators believed, had helped keep the fraud alive. That was the morning the whole machine began to come apart, but the operation itself had been built over years, because a dealership is almost the perfect laundering front if you understand how to use one. Cars are mobile assets. They carry value. They can be bought with cash, sold on paper, financed through false identities, moved across states, exported, retitled, repossessed, written off, or recycled through auctions with layers of documentation that look confusing even in legitimate business. But according to federal investigators, this dealership chain treated VINs less like fixed identities and more like tools. Some vehicles had plates swapped. Some paperwork carried numbers that belonged to different units. Some cars were sold multiple times through layered records. Some titles belonged to vehicles no longer physically present. Some cars listed as exported seemed to remain inside domestic circulation. Others disappeared from one set of books only to emerge elsewhere with cleaner identities. That kind of fraud does more than hide stolen cars. It creates cover. Because once the legal identity of the vehicle becomes flexible, the paperwork around money becomes flexible too. The first major warning signs came when financial investigators tracing narcotics proceeds noticed repeated overlap between cartel-linked shell entities and vehicle purchases that made no normal commercial sense. Some companies with no employees and no visible operations were buying or financing high-value inventory. Some buyers had no real income, unstable addresses, and credit files built on obvious fabrication. Some supposedly individual customers bought multiple expensive vehicles in short periods, then vanished. At first it looked like ordinary fraud, maybe credit fraud, maybe straw buyer fraud, maybe title fraud, but then the same dealership group kept resurfacing, then the same auction routes, then the same transport firms, then the same police names. That last part was what made the case radioactive. Because according to investigators, certain police officers were not merely failing to notice the fraud, they were helping contain it. Quietly, selectively, strategically. In a system as complicated as auto sales, one closed report can buy months of safety. One reassured reviewer can save an entire quarter of laundering activity. One compromised police contact can make a business feel untouchable. And that, investigators believe, is exactly what happened. Publicly, the owners projected confidence. They moved like men who had every reason to believe the business would never be touched. They bought real estate. They attended charity dinners. They expanded into financing. They opened another lot. They diversified into transport and auction services. They did all the things outwardly successful businessmen do when they want to look like growth itself. Because success is one of the best disguises in America. The more money a business appears to make, the less people ask whether the money is clean. According to the working theory, the dealership chain did not just wash cartel proceeds from drug sales. It also recycled value through the auto ecosystem itself. Vehicles were bought with dirty money, leveraged into financing, sold into shell company networks, moved across jurisdictions, and re-entered the books in ways that made the original cash source increasingly difficult to trace. By the time money emerged at the other end, it looked like profit, loan repayment, investment income, or sale revenue. That is what made the $500 million number believable. A dealership chain with multiple lots, access to title work, auctions, transport companies, financing structures, and a willingness to manipulate identities could absorb extraordinary volumes of dirty money without ever needing one giant, obvious dump of cash. It could vanish into commerce. The breakthrough reportedly came from a title clerk arrested on unrelated fraud charges. She described after-hours cleanup sessions where files were reworked after the showrooms closed, buyer packets were rebuilt, vehicle histories were adjusted, state submission dates were staggered, finance forms were replaced. Some cars, she said, existed in 2 realities at once, one for the public record and one for the house. That statement changed the investigation, because it suggested the chain wasn't merely making opportunistic fraudulent sales, it was operating a controlled dual system, a public system for appearances, a private system for laundering. Once analysts understood that, they started pulling everything apart: title trails, insurance claims, financing files, export records, auction logs, repair invoices, loan defaults, reconditioning costs, dealer transfers, and inventory aging reports. The results were devastating. Cars that should have had 1 legal history had 3, some had 5. Vehicles supposedly sold were still physically on the lot. Others listed in active inventory had already been exported. Some cars financed under private buyers later appeared tied to shell company fleets. Trade-in values were inflated in one location and deflated in another, allowing money to move invisibly between entities. A handful of luxury units had cycled through so many paper owners in so little time that they looked less like consumer vehicles and more like accounting devices, because that was what they were: accounting devices on wheels. And buried inside the records were the most dangerous entries of all: communication logs and handwritten references linking certain suspicious vehicle events to police contacts. Badge numbers, first names, dates, side notes that suggested when to clear a discrepancy, when not to worry about a plate issue, when a flagged VIN was safe, and when certain investigators needed to be avoided. Those details transformed the case from cartel finance to cartel corruption, because once law enforcement enters the chain, the business gains something more valuable than money. It gains confidence. Confidence that reports will die. Confidence that anomalies will be explained away. Confidence that anyone raising questions can be reassured by a badge. That is how the dealership chain became more than a laundering front. It became a fortress made of paperwork, access, and public trust. By midday on the day of the raid, the fallout had already spread through the broader vehicle ecosystem. State motor vehicle agencies were freezing titles. Insurance carriers were reviewing suspicious claims. Auction houses were being contacted about flagged vehicles. Banks were examining finance packages tied to shell borrowers. Honest customers were suddenly learning that the cars sitting in their driveways might carry histories attached to fraud, laundering, or manipulated identities. And that was one of the ugliest parts of the scheme. Operations like this do not only harm the abstract public, they contaminate ordinary people, families who thought they bought legitimate cars, employees who worked payroll and never saw the bigger picture, salesmen who genuinely believed they were hustling for commission inside a booming business, repair technicians who had no idea why certain cars were treated as special units. One cartel laundering system can poison an entire honest ecosystem around it. Still, investigators believe the core structure was not accidental, it was designed. The ownership group allegedly built layers around the dealership specifically to keep the money moving and the risk spread out. Finance companies under one name, transport firms under another, repair vendors, auction links, consulting entities, real estate holdings, and shell import-export structures all helped create motion and distance. If one piece came under scrutiny, another piece could explain it. That is how large criminal businesses survive. Not by having no weak points, by having enough moving parts that nobody can see the whole machine quickly. But eventually, large machines make too much noise, and this one had begun making noise everywhere. Suspicious title activity, impossible buyer patterns, duplicate VIN records, police contact notes, cartel-linked financial flows, the same names, the same lots, the same structure, again and again. By the time federal agents came through the doors before dawn, the real surprise wasn't that the chain was dirty. It was how much dirt it had been allowed to carry for so long. As the afternoon stretched into evening, evidence teams were still loading out titles, altered VIN plates, stamping tools, laptops, ledgers, cash, and finance records. Public corruption investigators were mapping the police side. DEA teams were tracing narcotics proceeds through the dealership entities. Financial crime analysts were trying to determine whether the $500 million figure was the top of the operation or just the first visible layer. Because that is always the question in cases like this. When you expose a laundering system that large, are you seeing the whole empire or just the clean front office of something even bigger? The showroom was quiet now. The balloons hung limp over the lot. The finance desks were empty. The keys had been tagged as evidence. And the public image of a thriving dealership empire had collapsed into something far darker. A cartel-owned business accused of turning America's used car market into a giant washing machine for narcotics money, while compromised officers helped keep the fraud looking legitimate. At 4:06 a.m., it was still just another car lot waiting for sunrise. By 4:47 a.m., agents were talking openly about VIN fraud cover. By 5:06 a.m., the laundering total had reached $500 million, and by the end of the day, the smiling face of a successful dealership chain had been replaced by the truth investigators believed had been hiding there all along. A cartel finance machine built on moving metal, fake buyers, dirty paperwork, and police protection. The offices were breached, the records were seized, the cops were being named. But one question remained hanging over every flagged title, every financed truck, every auctioned SUV, and every customer who had ever walked onto one of those lots believing they were entering an ordinary business. How many people bought cars from that chain without realizing they were driving away in a piece of a cartel laundering operation?
Mr. President, if you are declaring war against these cartels and Congress is likely to approve of that process, why not just ask for a declaration of war?
I don't think we're going to necessarily ask for a declaration of war. I think we're just going to kill people that are bringing drugs into our country. Okay? We're going to kill them. You know, they're going to be like dead.
Pay a record $3 billion in fines to American regulators for allowing drug cartels to use the bank's services for money laundering. Let's bring in Nivrita Ganguly to break it down for us. Nib, what exactly has pleaded guilty to, and how significant are these fines?
Well, the fines, they're historic, really. It's the largest penalty ever imposed by U.S. regulators on a bank under the anti-money laundering law.
It started at 4:07 a.m. That was the first moment the security shutter on the downtown transfer office began to rattle under the force of a hydraulic breach tool. Outside, the street was still dark. Storefronts were locked. Neon signs from a liquor mart across the road flickered weakly through the morning haze. A delivery truck rolled past without slowing, its driver never realizing that inside the unmarked building on the corner, federal agents were seconds away from tearing open one of the most dangerous financial pipelines they had ever tracked. Then the convoy arrived. 3 black SUVs stopped nose to tail along the curb. A white federal evidence van pulled in behind them. Another team moved from the rear alley toward a steel service door that led into the building's records room. By 4:11 a.m., the perimeter was sealed. By 4:13 a.m., agents had taken positions at the front lobby, the rear loading entrance, and the side staircase that led to the upstairs accounting office. No sirens, no warning to the neighborhood, no cameras, only short radio calls, dark jackets marked with federal lettering, and the heavy metallic sound of a business that had quietly moved money for years, now being forced open before sunrise. At 4:15 a.m., the front shutter gave way. At 4:16 a.m., the first team entered. At 4:18 a.m., the back office was secured. And at 4:20 a.m., the operation changed from a financial search to a full emergency evidence lockdown. Because inside the transfer office, investigators did not find the records of a small neighborhood remittance shop. They found a machine, stacks of handwritten ledgers, multiple counting stations, unregistered phones, heat-sealed bundles of cash, wall safes hidden behind office shelving, and most critically, coded transaction logs tying the storefront to a much larger web of shell businesses, courier channels, and overseas clearing points. By 4:26 a.m., agents in the upstairs office had seized 3 laptops and 2 encrypted drives. By 4:31 a.m., IRS forensic teams were already imaging systems on site. By 4:36 a.m., one of the accountants tried to delete transfer records from a hidden desktop terminal built into a false cabinet. Too late. By 4:42 a.m., investigators had pulled up the first transaction chain linking the office to a layered laundering route stretching across multiple states and foreign jurisdictions. And by 4:49 a.m., the number at the heart of the case was spoken aloud inside the mobile command van parked around the corner: $2.1 billion. That was the volume federal teams believed had been pushed through the network. Not in one year, not through one storefront, but through a coordinated system of transfers, proxies, false businesses, split deposits, and coded settlements built to move dirty money under the appearance of legitimate remittances. By 4:57 a.m., secondary warrants were being executed at 2 nearby exchange offices tied to the same network. By 5:04 a.m., another team hit a suburban home where one of the financial controllers lived. By 5:12 a.m., a storage unit registered under a logistics company was opened and found packed with archived ledgers, burner phones, identity packets, and vacuum-sealed cash. And by 5:19 a.m., the words investigators had dreaded were repeated in the briefing: terror financing and cartel laundering in the same pipeline. That was what made the case so explosive, because according to the working theory, the network was not merely washing tax fraud proceeds or local criminal cash, it was allegedly moving money linked to 2 of the most feared criminal ecosystems on Earth: Al-Shabaab on one end and the Sinaloa cartel on the other. Different continents, different structures, different goals, but the same financial truth. Both needed money to move without attracting attention. And the transfer network, investigators believed, had become the bridge. By 5:27 a.m., the first manager was led out in handcuffs. By 5:33 a.m., cash counters were still running on folding tables inside the evidence van. By 5:41 a.m., agents opened a hidden compartment beneath the floor of the upstairs office and found sealed notebooks filled with codes, initials, country abbreviations, dollar splits, and settlement references that did not belong in any lawful remittance business. At 5:52 a.m., a financial analyst matched one code sheet to international wires already flagged months earlier. That was the moment the raid stopped being a suspicion. It became confirmation. By 6:05 a.m., dawn was beginning to wash over the street. A few pedestrians stood back behind yellow tape. Shop owners in the block peered out from half-open doors. The transfer office that had looked harmless for years now stood exposed, its counters stripped bare, its computers boxed, its papers tagged like evidence from a homicide scene. And in a way, investigators believed it was worse than that, because killings leave bodies. Financial pipelines like this leave something harder to see. Power. Power for gunmen. Power for smugglers. Power for networks that survive because money moves more quietly than bullets. That was the morning the system cracked open. But the laundering pipeline itself had not begun in a single dramatic move. It began, like most sophisticated financial crime, by hiding inside something ordinary. A transfer office, a cash remittance desk, a service used every day by working families sending money across borders. That was what made the network so effective. Remittance businesses are built on trust, speed, and community familiarity. People walk in with cash, they send support to relatives, they pay fees, they leave. From the outside, everything looks normal. Small transactions, local customers, busy counters, ledger books, modest storefronts, the kind of place almost nobody imagines could sit at the center of a multi-billion-dollar laundering pipeline. According to investigators, that normal appearance was the perfect camouflage. The network allegedly operated on two layers. The first layer was real business, legitimate transfers, family remittances, community support payments, local commerce. The second layer was hidden underneath. Dirty money folded into transfer flows, split into smaller movements, balanced through informal settlement systems, and reconciled later through shell import-export firms, fake invoices, currency swaps, and offshore clearing relationships. In other words, the storefront did not just send money, it disguised where money came from. And when a system can do that well enough, it becomes valuable to anyone with huge amounts of illicit cash to move. That was the link to the cartel. Investigators believed the Sinaloa side of the pipeline used the network to wash narcotics proceeds generated inside the United States. Bulk cash from drug corridors would be broken down, fed into front businesses, inserted into transfer streams, then settled through trade-based laundering mechanisms that made the original criminal source harder to detect. False import invoices, overvalued goods, consulting payments, and freight settlements turned drug cash into something that could appear commercial. The terror financing side, investigators feared, moved differently. Not always massive shipments of cash, sometimes smaller routed transfers, layered donations, sympathetic intermediaries, business payments with coded meanings, dispersed funding arranged through people who never directly met those at the far end of the chain. The amounts might look smaller in single transactions, but the effect was the same. Value moved invisibly through a trusted system and emerged in places where it could fund recruitment, logistics, weapons, propaganda, or operational survival. That was what made the network so dangerous. It was not just laundering criminal profit, it was allegedly laundering purpose. By the time investigators were ready to move, they had spent months building the case. At first, all they had were anomalies. Cash-heavy businesses filing records that didn't match foot traffic, transfer volumes far exceeding neighborhood demand, repeated transaction patterns clustering around the same handlers, and settlement ratios that made no sense for an ordinary remittance operator. Then came the tax side. IRS financial crime teams noticed linked entities claiming revenue streams that seemed circular, inflated, or disconnected from any real commercial activity. One company invoiced for wholesale electronics but had no warehouse. Another declared consulting revenue across 3 states with no staff. A freight broker showed large settlement activity but almost no actual shipping footprint. A food importer made payments inconsistent with food margins. Individually, each business looked odd. Together, they looked engineered. That was when investigators stopped asking whether the transfer network was bending rules. They started asking who it was serving. The first break reportedly came from a courier arrested on an unrelated tax fraud charge. Trying to reduce his own exposure, he described cash deliveries made not to banks but to settlement houses, disguised as ordinary businesses. He named code words. He described backroom ledgers. He explained that some transfers were never meant to move electronically at all. The numbers were entered into a balancing system, offset against other flows elsewhere, and only later reconciled through trade invoices and foreign counterparties. That was the architecture investigators needed. Once they understood the hidden settlement logic, the numbers began aligning. Stores in different cities that seemed unrelated were actually balancing one another. Small transfers were masking large obligations. Front companies existed not to make profit, but to justify movement. The network was not just passing cash around, it was cleansing it. And the deeper analysts went, the darker the endpoints became. Some flows mapped into narcotics corridors already associated with cartel laundering behavior. Others touched regions, charities, businesses, or intermediaries that triggered terror financing concern. Most of the participants likely did not see the whole map. That is how networks like this survive. A runner only sees the package. A teller only sees the cash. A bookkeeper only sees the code. A shell company owner only sees the invoice. Each person holds one small, deniable piece, but someone at the top sees all of it. That was who the raid was designed to reach. Publicly, the operators behind the transfer network looked respectable. They dressed conservatively, they spoke the language of community service, cross-border family support, trust, and financial access for immigrants underserved by big banks. That image made scrutiny difficult. Nobody wants to believe a neighborhood transfer business can become a highway for cartel cash and extremist financing. Nobody wants to tell honest working families that the counter they rely on might be contaminated by criminal networks. But according to the investigation, that is exactly why the system worked. It fed on familiarity. It borrowed legitimacy from the people it served honestly while secretly monetizing the flows of people it served criminally. And the amounts were staggering. $2.1 billion meant the network had reached industrial scale. Not random laundering, not isolated fraud. Industrial laundering. The kind that requires layered bookkeeping, disciplined settlement, multiple jurisdictions, protected handlers, redundant channels, and the confidence that regulators, tax authorities, and law enforcement would keep seeing only fragments instead of the whole structure. That confidence began collapsing once the raid teams got inside. The upstairs office reportedly held the key links, balancing ledgers, alias lists, phone trees, shell company maps, and coded references showing how certain customers were treated differently from normal retail senders. Priority codes, no ID approvals, delayed settlement marks, offset instructions. One ledger reportedly separated flows into categories that investigators believed corresponded to risk type and destination type. Another recorded special settlement obligations far larger than what any visible storefront revenue could justify. And buried beneath all of that was the ugliest part of the case. This was not an accidental vulnerability. It was, investigators believed, an intentionally designed laundering service. By midday, the fallout had already spread well beyond the original office. Other businesses tied to the same network were being searched. Bank accounts were frozen. Tax records were subpoenaed. Freight firms, currency brokers, consulting fronts, and import-export companies all came under scrutiny. Some operators insisted they were legitimate and blamed rogue accountants. Others claimed they had no idea where the money really originated. A few simply went silent. That silence spoke volumes, because lawful remittance operators do not need hidden safes, code ledgers, burner phones, and shell companies with no real business. Lawful transfer businesses do not structure money around secrecy and deniability. Lawful settlement houses do not create financial blind spots large enough to hide both terror-linked funds and cartel proceeds inside the same machinery. The case was devastating not just because of the money, but because of what that money represented. Cartel cash means addiction, violence, extortion, and death moving behind the facade of commerce. Terror-linked cash means logistics, recruitment, intimidation, and bloodshed financed through the quiet arithmetic of transfer codes and balancing sheets. One pipeline touching both worlds suggested something chilling. Criminal finance had become global enough that ideology and narcotics no longer needed to share a mission, to share a method. They only needed the same service. And that service, investigators believed, had been operating for years in plain sight. For the public, the betrayal ran deep. Transfer offices are part of daily life in many communities. They exist because families need to support one another across borders. They are practical, personal, trusted places. To learn that such a network could allegedly be infiltrated or built outright as a laundering machine damages more than one case. It damages confidence. Honest customers begin wondering whether they were ever safe. Legitimate operators face suspicion they do not deserve. Communities that rely on remittance systems end up paying the social price for criminals who hid inside them. That is the lasting poison of financial crime at this scale. It steals trust along with money. As evening approached, evidence teams were still cataloging devices, ledgers, tax files, and cash. Forensic accountants were mapping flows outward. Counter-terror investigators were tracing one branch. Narcotics finance teams were tracing the other. Every hour seemed to widen the network. Every ledger line suggested another business, another courier, another settlement point, another person who might have told himself he was only moving numbers, not enabling what happened after those numbers arrived. But numbers are never just numbers in cases like this. They are fuel. Fuel for cartels, fuel for armed groups, fuel for networks that can survive only as long as somebody somewhere keeps turning dirty money into usable power. At 4:07 a.m., the transfer office still looked like an ordinary storefront. By 4:49 a.m., federal agents were staring at a $2.1 billion laundering map. By 5:19 a.m., the same network was being linked to both cartel cash and terror financing channels. And by the end of the day, the harmless image of a neighborhood money transfer counter had been replaced by something far darker. A hidden financial engine accused of washing billions, shielding criminal empires, and turning trusted remittance pathways into conduits for violence on multiple continents. The doors were broken, the ledgers were seized, the handlers were in custody. But one question remained hanging over the whole case long after the raid was over. How many wars and trafficking routes were funded because the money looked ordinary on the way through?
This caper sounds like it was inspired by a movie, or maybe it's so absurd it was inspired by a cartoon. Look right over there. You can see it now opened up, but that was the tunnel that the FBI opened up, and they found it. This morning, the FBI in Florida is digging for answers after discovering a tunnel leading to treasure.
This is truly a unique case here.
Agents say a call to a road crew about a sinkhole in Pembroke Pines led to a tunnel at least 50 yards long. Near the entrance in the woods, a pair of boots, a generator, a rope, and a wagon.
So now they're coming in by land, and even the land is concerned because I told them that's going to be next. You know, the land is going to be next, and we may go to the Senate, we may go to the, Congress, and we're going to definitely, I'd like to just tell you, let's go. We'll go. We're going to tell them what we're going to do, and I think they're going to probably like it, except...
It started at 1:43 a.m. That was the first moment the motion sensors tripped beneath the south maintenance corridor near the edge of the Army base. Above ground, everything looked normal. Floodlights washed over chain-link fencing. Guard towers stood still against the night sky. A dry wind moved across the outer service road, carrying dust and the low mechanical hum of distant generators. Most of the base was asleep. A few late-shift vehicles rolled through designated lanes. Nothing in the open suggested that just below the surface, one of the most explosive cartel smuggling discoveries in years was about to break wide open. Then the convoy arrived. 3 black federal SUVs entered through a restricted access point. A tactical truck followed behind. 2 more vehicles peeled off toward the southern perimeter, where engineers and federal narcotics teams had been quietly monitoring unusual underground activity for weeks. By 1:49 a.m., the Operation Command Post was active. By 1:52 a.m., the outer perimeter around the suspected tunnel zone was sealed. By 1:55 a.m., military police had been ordered to hold position and allow federal teams to take lead control. No alarms were sounded across the base, no loud public warnings, no panic, only hushed radio traffic, coded instructions, and agents moving quickly through dark service lanes with the kind of urgency that comes when everyone involved knows the next 30 minutes could decide whether evidence is preserved or buried forever. At 1:58 a.m., the first ground-penetrating scan team moved into position. At 2:03 a.m., a maintenance hatch near an abandoned utility shed was forced open. At 2:06 a.m., agents dropped into a narrow access chamber concealed beneath what looked, on the surface, like a routine storage slab near the edge of the base's logistics zone. What they found below changed everything. There was air ventilation, there were power cables, there were reinforced walls. And stretching away into darkness was a tunnel, professionally cut, structurally braced, and large enough to move bulk loads through in silence. This was not some improvised escape shaft. This was infrastructure. By 2:11 a.m., the tunnel was confirmed active. By 2:15 a.m., a second entry team followed the passage deeper underground. By 2:19 a.m., they found rail guides and wheeled cargo platforms built to move heavy loads efficiently through the earth. At 2:24 a.m., the first narcotics bundles were recovered. At 2:27 a.m., the command vehicle above ground received the message that instantly transformed the operation from a sensitive military corruption probe into a national-level cartel scandal. The tunnel ran under a U.S. Army base. Not beside it, not near it, under it. And if the early evidence was right, cartel smugglers had been using subterranean routes below protected military land, while compromised personnel on the base helped keep the pathway clear. By 2:33 a.m., another team was moving toward on-base barracks tied to two soldiers already under internal suspicion. By 2:37 a.m., the first detained service member was pulled from his room in silence and handcuffed before most of his unit even understood what was happening. By 2:41 a.m., encrypted phones, cash bundles, and access logs were being seized from two separate quarters. By 2:48 a.m., investigators had begun saying the words that would define the case: soldiers bribed, not civilians with temporary badges, not contractors slipping through weak oversight, active duty soldiers accused of helping a cartel tunnel operate under the protected footprint of an American military installation. At 2:56 a.m., the second tunnel branch was discovered. This one was narrower, but better concealed, with false earth panels, drainage support, and built-in lighting timed to portable battery systems. Deeper inside, investigators found more bundled narcotics, coded shipment markers, and evidence that the tunnel had not been used once or twice in desperation. It had been used repeatedly. By 3:04 a.m., the seizure estimates started climbing. Hundreds of kilograms became thousands. By 3:18 a.m., cargo count teams were still hauling packages from underground staging sections. By 3:27 a.m., the number was relayed upward through the chain. 4.2 tons seized. That was the amount recovered from the tunnel complex and connected transfer points in the first phase of the raid. 4.2 tons. Enough to turn the operation from an already shocking infiltration case into one of the largest cartel tunnel seizures ever linked to a military-adjacent route. By 3:39 a.m., daylight was still hours away, but the base no longer felt like a secure installation. It felt like a compromised zone. That was the morning the scandal exploded. But the story had started much earlier, months before the raid, when small irregularities began surfacing around the southern logistics boundary. At first, it looked like nothing: a few strange vibration readings, minor anomalies in subsurface maintenance scans, a service road camera going offline at odd hours, patrol timing reports that didn't line up cleanly. Then came something more troubling. Certain perimeter observation windows kept producing the same dead zones. Brief stretches when visibility, movement logs, and sensor consistency all seemed to bend just enough to create uncertainty. Not enough to trigger immediate panic, but enough to irritate the analysts reviewing base security systems. Someone somewhere seemed to understand exactly how long a blind patch could last before it started looking intentional. Then the narcotics side of the investigation entered the picture. DEA-linked intelligence had already been examining a trafficking network believed to be shifting away from obvious border routes and toward highly protected corridors where suspicion would be least expected. Loads kept disappearing from known cartel staging patterns, only to reappear deeper inside the distribution chain with no clear crossing record. At first, investigators assumed the traffickers were using private land, drainage systems, or commercial concealment corridors. But one geographic pattern kept surfacing. The loads seemed to bypass scrutiny near a zone nobody wanted to consider: the base perimeter. That possibility sounded absurd at first. Cartels exploit weak places, not hardened military ground. But that assumption is exactly what made the route so powerful, if it was real. So federal investigators and select military counterintelligence personnel began working in silence, quietly, carefully. Because if the suspicion was true, a leak on the wrong day could collapse the case and bury the evidence, literally. They reviewed subsurface imagery, they mapped old utility corridors, they compared maintenance access patterns with off-base movement, they studied which personnel had repeated, unexplained presence near low-traffic areas along the southern edge. That was when names began surfacing: soldiers with financial inconsistencies, soldiers with unexplained cash, soldiers whose access card logs showed odd late-night movement near non-essential service lanes. Nothing dramatic at first, just patterns, small ones. But in corruption cases, patterns are where betrayal starts showing its face. One soldier had deposits no junior enlisted salary could explain. Another had recently paid off personal debt in a way that triggered quiet questions. A third had been communicating through apps that disappeared almost as quickly as they were installed. Separately, they looked like discipline issues or personal irregularities. Together, they began to resemble compromise. Investigators would later come to believe the soldiers were not tunnel engineers and not cartel masterminds. Their value was simpler and therefore more dangerous. They knew routines, they knew patrol timing, they knew where service zones were quiet, they knew which cameras mattered, which reports got reviewed slowly, which sectors drew less traffic, and how long an unofficial gap could exist before someone asked questions. That is all a cartel needs from inside a protected zone. Not genius, not ideology, just access sold in pieces. The tunnel itself appeared to be a professional operation. Reinforced sections, ventilation support, drainage planning, cargo movement rails, concealment architecture. This was not dug by amateurs with shovels and luck. It had money behind it, technical supervision, and the kind of patience only a high-value trafficking corridor justifies. And that made the military angle even more disturbing, because a tunnel of that quality does not merely rely on dirt and darkness. It relies on confidence. Confidence that nobody above will see it in time. Confidence that the people closest to the ground will keep quiet. Confidence that the most protected land is also the least questioned. That was the real genius of the route. The cartel had not just found a way under the border, it had found a way under trust itself. Publicly, the soldiers later tied to the case looked ordinary, uniformed, disciplined. Young men serving on a U.S. Army base in a region where the pressure of border enforcement, trafficking intelligence, and military infrastructure all existed uncomfortably close together. No one looking at a formation line would know which faces had allegedly taken money. No one walking through the barracks would know who had turned classified routine into smuggling opportunity. But investigators believe that was precisely how the corridor stayed alive. The cartel did not need battalion-level corruption. It needed a few compromised people near the right fence, at the right hour, in the right silence. According to the case theory, those soldiers helped in several ways: reducing scrutiny near sensitive sections, timing movement windows, sharing knowledge about patrol gaps, and ensuring certain activity near maintenance zones did not trigger urgent response. They were not moving 4.2 tons on their backs. They were making sure the system meant to detect the movement stayed just blind enough for others to do the work. And that is what made the case so devastating. Not just that drugs crossed, but that military protection may have been quietly rented by traffickers. The first real break reportedly came when underground acoustic anomalies lined up with suspicious personnel movement on the same nights. A pattern that once looked like random mechanical noise began to look rhythmic, intentional. Soon after, hidden camera placements near the southern service corridor showed brief, repeated activity at hours when nobody should have been there. Then came thermal irregularities in the soil. Then a maintenance hatch that seemed too recently disturbed. Then the covert scans that showed hollow sections beneath ground no one had officially excavated. Once investigators had that, the raid became inevitable. Because if a cartel tunnel really ran under Army land, every day of delay meant more product moving, more evidence shifting, and more time for compromised insiders to clean up their part of the trail. That is why the operation came in darkness. Why barracks were hit quietly. Why military police were told to hold back. Why the tunnel teams moved fast. By sunrise, the scandal was already spiraling outward. Command staff were scrambling to understand the scope. Were only a few soldiers involved? Had supervisors missed warning signs? Did any civilians on base know? Were contractors part of the logistics chain? How many previous loads had moved through the tunnel before the 4.2 tons now sitting in evidence? Because that is the thing about a seizure of this size. It is never the whole story. It is the load that got caught. And once people understand that, the real question becomes terrifying. If 4.2 tons were seized in one operation, how much had already passed? The political and symbolic fallout hit immediately. Army bases are not just pieces of land. They are national trust zones. They represent discipline, order, defense, and sacrifice. To hear that cartel tunnels may have operated beneath one, with soldiers allegedly bribed into cooperation, strikes at something deeper than a trafficking headline. It suggests not merely a border vulnerability, but an institutional one. It tells the public that criminal organizations are no longer just testing fences and patrols. They are studying systems, recruiting insiders, buying silence, building beneath the feet of people who were supposed to stop them. That is why the betrayal mattered as much as the narcotics. For honest service members, it was poison. The idea that fellow soldiers might have sold access to traffickers cut directly against the culture of duty and trust. Bases run on reliability. Orders matter because the person next to you is supposed to mean what he says. Once that confidence cracks, even for a small group, the damage runs far beyond one criminal case. Every unusual movement gets re-examined. Every unexplained absence feels suspicious. Every late-night maintenance check looks different in hindsight. And the cartel understands the value of that chaos. Smugglers do not merely profit from physical routes. They profit from damaged confidence. The more institutions doubt themselves, the easier the next compromise becomes. By midday, evidence teams were still cataloging recovered narcotics, tunnel hardware, devices, money, and access records. Engineers were mapping the full underground route. Counterintelligence units were tracing communications between the soldiers and suspected cartel intermediaries. Financial investigators were pulling apart deposits, cash handling, gift purchases, debt payments, and contact chains. Search warrants were widening. More names were surfacing. Some appeared to be peripheral, others looked more central. The fear now was obvious. Was this a contained betrayal, or the visible edge of a larger corruption channel running through military and civilian networks alike? Because tunnels of this sophistication do not live on one bribe alone. They require coordination on both sides. Digging teams, transport teams, receiving crews, warehouse handlers, money people, communicators. And on the protected side, at least a few insiders who understand exactly how much silence is worth. That was the hidden architecture investigators were now trying to expose. And as the hours passed, the tunnel changed in public imagination from a criminal route into something almost cinematic in its audacity. Cartel engineers burrowing beneath an army base while compromised soldiers above helped preserve the illusion that the ground was solid, secure, and ordinary. But there was nothing ordinary about it. Not the reinforced walls, not the cargo rails, not the ventilation, not the 4.2 tons seized, not the uniforms hanging in barracks while federal agents carried evidence boxes past them before dawn. At 1:43 a.m., the base still looked like hardened military ground. By 2:27 a.m., agents had confirmed a live cartel tunnel running beneath it. By 3:27 a.m., the seizure total had climbed to 4.2 tons. And by the end of the operation, the story was no longer just about drugs or dirt or hidden engineering. It was about betrayal from underneath, a cartel route built below American military land, soldiers accused of taking bribes to help keep it open, and a federal raid that finally brought the whole buried system into the light. The drugs were seized, the tunnel was exposed, the soldiers were in custody. But one question remained hanging over the base long after sunrise. How many shipments passed under American boots before anyone realized the ground had already been sold?